You think women cheat because they found someone hotter, someone with more money, someone more exciting, more spontaneous, more physically compelling. You think it's about attraction, that somewhere along the way, the woman looked at the man she was with and looked at someone else and decided the comparison didn't favor her partner anymore. That's the surface answer. That's the story that gets told in movies, in breakup conversations, in the explanations people give when the real explanation is harder to say out loud. The real reason is structural, and it almost never starts with another person. Cheating rarely begins in the bedroom. It begins in emotional perception. It begins in the accumulation of small moments, small absences, small failures of attention, small signals of disconnection that build over months or sometimes years into a distance that no one planned and everyone feels, but neither person knows how to address. By the time there is another person involved, there has usually already been a long internal process, a gradual reassessment, a quiet searching, a growing awareness that something essential is missing, and it has been missing for a long time. Today, you are going to understand the psychological shift that happens before betrayal ever occurs, not to justify it, not to excuse it, to understand the mechanism. Because the mechanism is what matters if you actually want to prevent it. And most men are focused entirely on the wrong variables. It starts before the affair, long before. And once you understand where it actually starts, everything about how to maintain a relationship changes. Let's begin with the truth that most conversations about infidelity avoid. Most women do not cheat for novelty. They do not wake up one morning and decide to introduce chaos into a stable life for the excitement of it. The psychological profile of female infidelity across the research that exists on this topic is significantly more connected to perceived emotional detachment than it is to physical desire. This does not mean the physical dimension is irrelevant. It means it is rarely primary, rarely the origin. The origin is almost always earlier and deeper. Feeling unseen is one of the most corrosive experiences in a long-term relationship, and it is one of the most common. It does not mean that the partner is literally ignoring the other person. It means that the quality of attention has degraded, that the conversations have become transactional, that the emotional presence has thinned, that the person who once seemed genuinely fascinated by who you were and what you thought and what you felt has become someone who is physically present but psychologically elsewhere. This experience of being in the same room with someone who is no longer really there is one of the most consistent predictors of relationship deterioration. Not the dramatic conflicts, the quiet absence. Feeling unheard is the relational expression of the same problem. When a woman brings something to her partner, a concern, a frustration, an observation, a need, and finds that it is deflected, minimized, half listened to, or responded to with solutions when what was needed was understanding, the communication loop that sustains emotional intimacy begins to close, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Each failed attempt to connect at depth is a small withdrawal from the emotional account of the relationship. And if the pattern persists without renewal, the account empties. Feeling emotionally unsupported is the cumulative experience of these patterns. When a woman consistently feels that she is carrying her emotional life alone, that her internal world is not being met with genuine curiosity, genuine presence, genuine engagement, she does not necessarily leave immediately. She may not even acknowledge to herself that there is a serious problem, but she begins, often unconsciously, to turn elsewhere. not necessarily to another man. Initially, to friends, to work, to the things in her life that do provide the engagement and validation that is absent at home. Physical absence versus emotional absence. That is the binary. And of the two, emotional absence is more dangerous to the relationship. A man can be geographically distant, traveling for work, consumed by a demanding project. And the relationship can sustain that if the emotional connection is maintained through other means. A man can be physically present every evening and every weekend and still be functionally absent if the quality of his presence is low. If he is there in body but not in attention, not in curiosity, not in genuine engagement with the person sitting across from him. Disconnection creates vulnerability, not immediately, not loudly, but reliably. Now let's go to a deeper level, because understanding the psychological mechanism requires understanding the biological one underneath it. Human mating psychology did not develop in the context of modern relationships, modern social norms, or modern ethical frameworks. It developed in an evolutionary environment where different pressures applied and different strategies were adaptive. This is not a moral argument. It is a mechanistic one. Understanding the mechanism does not justify the behavior. It explains the conditions under which certain behaviors become more likely. Women's long-term mating strategy has been shaped over millions of years of selection pressure around the optimization of security. Security in the broadest sense, not just financial security, though that is part of it, but directional security, protective security, the sense that the partner one has chosen is capable of providing for and protecting the shared life and any children within it. When that sense of security is high, commitment tends to stabilize. When that sense of security drops, when the partner begins to seem less capable, less decisive, less capable of providing the orientation and leadership the relationship requires, a reassessment process begins. Again, this is not a conscious decision in most cases. It is a shift in felt experience that then produces shifts in behavior. Mate switching theory in evolutionary psychology refers to the tendency of organisms to reassess and potentially transition to a higher quality mate when circumstances make that feasible. When the perceived quality of the current partnership drops, when the availability of alternative partners rises, or when both happen simultaneously. In modern human relationships, this plays out not as a clinical calculation, but as a gradual, emotional drift. The woman does not sit down and decide to trade in her partner. She begins to feel less certain, less drawn, less like her future is securely oriented toward this person and this life. And that uncertainty, if it persists and grows, makes her increasingly receptive to alternatives. Emotional validation as a stability cue is perhaps the most critical mechanism in this framework for understanding how modern relationships function. Emotional validation, the experience of being genuinely understood, genuinely appreciated, genuinely seen, functions in the female psychology as a primary signal of partner investment. It signals that the partner cares, that the partner is paying attention, that the partner considers her emotional world important enough to engage with. When this signal is consistently present, the relationship feels stable and valuable. When it degrades or disappears, the stability of the relationship is experienced as degrading. Not because the love has disappeared, but because the evidence of love, the behavioral, attentive, emotionally engaged evidence has thinned. When perceived security drops, reassessment begins. This is the statement to take forward. It is not dramatic. It is not accompanied by a decision or a conversation or a moment of conscious deliberation in most cases. It is the quiet beginning of a process that, if unaddressed, produces outcomes that seem sudden to outsiders but were years in the making. Now let's walk through how this process actually unfolds. Because cheating is almost never a sudden event, it is the end of a gradual drift that had structure, that had stages, that could theoretically have been interrupted at multiple points along the way. The first stage is emotional distance. This is the foundational layer, the growing gap between two people who are technically together but are experiencing less and less genuine connection. It is often mutual, even if only one person is clearly aware of it. The conversations become shorter and more practical. The evenings are filled with parallel activity rather than shared engagement. The physical affection that was once spontaneous becomes routine and then intermittent. Neither person necessarily makes a decision to create this distance. It grows in the absence of deliberate maintenance, in the space left by busy schedules, by the comfort of familiarity, by the false assumption that a relationship that has been good will remain good without continued investment. The second stage is reduced communication. This is the natural consequence of the first. When emotional distance grows, the quality and depth of communication deteriorates. The conversations that do happen are increasingly logistical. Who is picking up what? Who is handling which responsibility? What is happening when? The conversations that would actually address the growing distance about feelings, about needs, about what is missing, about what both people want from each other and from the relationship, become increasingly rare. Not because either person decides not to have them, but because the deterioration of the connection makes vulnerability feel increasingly risky. To open up about what you're missing requires the belief that you will be genuinely met with empathy and engagement. When that belief has eroded, the opening up stops. The third stage is increased comparison. This is where the environment begins to matter more. The woman who is emotionally underserved in a relationship becomes more aware of what she is not receiving. She notices the colleague who actually listens when she speaks. She notices the friend who asks real questions and waits for real answers. She notices the man at the gym who looks at her with genuine interest. These comparisons are not necessarily pursued or encouraged. They arise naturally in a mind that has begun registering the gap between what it is experiencing and what it remembers wanting. Social media accelerates this process. The curated idealization of other relationships, the reconnection with previous partners, the constant ambient exposure to alternatives. All of it intensifies the comparison process in ways that would have been structurally impossible before these platforms existed. The fourth stage is external validation seeking. This is the transition point. This is where the emotional need, which has not been met internally, begins to be sourced externally. It starts small and ambiguous. She tells a coworker more than she would have a year ago. She texts an old friend more. She stays at a work event longer because the environment there feels more engaging than the environment at home. She is not planning anything. She is filling a deficit. But the filling of that deficit outside the relationship marks the beginning of a process that is far harder to reverse once it has started. Affairs begin with attention shifts. The physical dimension comes later, if it comes at all. The emotional boundary crosses first. Let's go deeper into the validation dimension specifically, because this is one of the most important mechanisms in the entire framework. When emotional validation declines inside a relationship, it gets sourced externally. This is not complicated. It is basic human psychology. People need to feel that they matter, that they are seen, that their interior life is worth engaging with, that their presence makes a difference to the people around them. In a healthy relationship, this need is met primarily within the partnership, through the partner's attention, curiosity, appreciation, and genuine engagement. When that source of validation dries up, the need does not disappear. It redirects. The experience of being taken for granted is one of the most commonly reported precursors to infidelity in the research literature. Being taken for granted is not an overt form of disrespect. It is the absence of active appreciation. It is the partner who never comments on how she looks because he has stopped noticing. The partner who no longer asks about her day because he assumes he already knows. The partner who has stopped expressing specific gratitude for specific things because the routine of them has made them invisible. The partner who is so secure in the relationship that he has stopped doing the things that created the security in the first place. This dynamic, the comfort that erodes the connection it was supposed to protect, is one of the most common and most dangerous patterns in long-term relationships. Taken for granted versus actively appreciated, that is the binary. The woman who feels actively appreciated, whose partner notices her, says so, expresses specific gratitude, shows genuine interest in her inner life, demonstrates through his behavior that her presence in his life is valued and not assumed. That woman does not experience the validation vacuum. The woman who has been taken for granted for long enough begins sourcing validation wherever she can find it. Not because she has decided to be unfaithful, because the human need for genuine appreciation does not disappear just because the relationship has become comfortable. Attention is currency. This is not a romantic statement. It is a psychological one. Wherever someone's attention goes consistently, that is where their emotional investment is concentrated. In a healthy relationship, the partner's attention is oriented toward each other in a meaningful proportion of the time. When one partner's attention is consistently redirected toward work, toward screens, toward other people, toward the comfortable numbness of passive entertainment, the emotional relationship between the partners begins to wither. And the partner on the receiving end of that redirected attention begins to feel it as exactly what it is: deprioritization. Now let's address the dimension that is perhaps the most important and the least discussed: the leadership vacuum effect. Many relationships collapse not because of cruelty, not because of betrayal, not because of obvious failure, but because the masculine direction in the relationship gradually erodes, because the decisiveness and orientation and emotional leadership that characterized the early relationship softens into passivity, and the dynamic that was once engaging becomes stagnant. Loss of decisiveness is one of the first symptoms. The man who once had clear opinions, who initiated experiences, who made choices without endless deliberation or constant deference, that man becomes, over time, someone who says whatever you want, and you decide, and I don't mind either way. This may feel like flexibility. It may even be intended as consideration. But in the context of an intimate relationship, consistent indecisiveness reads as the absence of investment, as the absence of leadership, as the absence of the direction that once made the relationship feel like it was going somewhere specific. Over comfort is the state that produces this erosion. The man who was at his best when he was building something, when the relationship was new, when he was working to earn her, when he had something to prove, relaxes once the relationship is established. The chase is over. The comfort of security sets in. And with it, often comes a decline in the qualities that created the attraction in the first place. He stops grooming as carefully. He stops initiating as deliberately. He stops bringing the presence and energy and intention that made her feel like she was with a man who was genuinely alive to the world and to her. He becomes comfortable, and comfort in the wrong proportion kills attraction. Emotional passivity is the internal correlate of this pattern. The man who has become comfortable stops bringing his emotional presence fully into the relationship. He processes his stress at work by coming home and disengaging. He manages his frustrations by withdrawing rather than by working through them in the relationship. He meets her attempts to connect with half attention and deflection. He is not trying to damage the relationship. He is operating from a default state that the relationship's comfort has made too easy to settle into. But the impact on his partner is real. She feels the absence. She feels the passivity. And she begins to miss the man who was present. Conflict avoidance is the behavior that emerges from this passivity that does the most damage. Because conflict, handled well, is not a threat to a relationship. It is a vehicle for genuine engagement. It is how two people who care about each other work through the real differences and real frustrations that accumulate in any shared life. The man who avoids conflict, who refuses to engage with friction, who dismisses concerns rather than addressing them, who changes the subject or withdraws when things become uncomfortable, that man is not protecting the relationship. He is allowing problems to accumulate underground until they become structural and irreversible. Stagnation kills attraction. This is the statement. Not conflict, not difficulty, not even distance necessarily. Stagnation, the feeling that nothing is being built, that nothing is being risked, that the relationship has arrived at a plateau and the man at its center is not moving, not growing, not bringing a direction that pulls her into a future she finds compelling. The relationship becomes a thing to maintain rather than a thing to build. And maintenance is not attractive. Building is. Let's go to the midpoint, the tension between comfort and attraction. Comfort alone cannot sustain attraction. This is one of the truths about long-term intimate relationships that almost no one prepares people for. The qualities that make a relationship feel safe and stable. The predictability, the familiarity, the security of knowing this person deeply and being deeply known are genuinely valuable. They are part of what makes a committed relationship different from all other relationships, but they are not sufficient. Comfort without the counterbalance of genuine aliveness, of continued growth, of the sense that you are with someone who still surprises you, still challenges you, still has dimensions you have not fully mapped. Comfort without these things becomes suffocating rather than reassuring. Stability without polarity versus stability with tension. That is the binary. The relationship that has stabilized into pure comfort, where everything is safe and nothing is dynamic, where the partners know each other so well that there is no mystery left, where the masculine and feminine energies have flattened into a kind of genderless roommate dynamic. That relationship is vulnerable, not because the partners don't love each other, but because love is not the same thing as attraction. Love can persist in the absence of attraction, but the relationship will show the strain of that absence. Polarity is the energetic dynamic between genuine masculine and feminine expression in a relationship. When it is present, it creates tension, not conflict, but the generative tension of two different energies in dynamic relationship with each other. The man who maintains his direction, his decisiveness, his groundedness, his capacity to lead, and who is with a woman who is genuinely in her feminine expression, who is responsive, who is open, who is trusting, that couple has polarity. The couple that has flattened into mutual agreeableness and parallel comfort has lost it. And the loss of polarity is experienced as a loss of aliveness in the relationship. Attraction requires edge, not cruelty, not coldness, not dominance games. Edge, the sense that this person has dimensions you have not fully accessed, that there is something just beyond your complete understanding of them that remains compelling, that they are genuinely their own person with their own direction and standards who chooses to be with you rather than needing to be with you. The man who has maintained that edge, who is still growing, still building, still in some sense a moving target that she is choosing to keep up with, is the man whose partner does not stop being attracted to him. The man who has allowed comfort to flatten him into a predictable, passive, fully mapped presence has lost the edge, and with it, often, the attraction, now the modern context, because this generation faces specific conditions that previous generations did not. The comparison trap has never been more structurally accessible than it is in 2026, and the access to comparison has a real and measurable impact on relationship satisfaction and relationship vulnerability. Social media exposure is the most pervasive dimension of this. The platforms that are woven into the daily lives of most people in long-term relationships are optimized through exactly the same behavioral engineering mechanisms that make them addictive for everyone, for engagement. And one of the highest engagement categories of content is aspirational relationship content. The couple that appears perfectly aligned, perfectly attuned, perfectly happy. The partner who does the romantic gesture, who remembers the small things, who expresses love in exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. This content is curated. It is the highlight reel of someone else's relationship, carefully selected to present the best possible version and posted in a context designed to maximize positive response. But the brain does not automatically process it that way. The brain compares it to the unedited reality of its own relationship, and the unedited reality of any real relationship, with its frustrations and its silences and its failures and its ordinariness, consistently loses that comparison. X reappearances are a specific modern phenomenon enabled by social connectivity that has no historical precedent at the scale we now experience. The woman who has not thought about a previous relationship in years can suddenly receive a message, see a profile update, encounter a mutual friend's post, and find that a connection she thought was closed is suddenly reopened. This does not automatically create a threat to her current relationship, but it creates access to a comparison that was previously unavailable. And if the current relationship is in a state of emotional underinvestment, the reopened connection to someone who once made her feel seen and valued arrives into a context that is receptive to it. Workplace proximity is the environmental factor that has historically been the most consistent incubator of emotional affairs. People spend enormous amounts of time with their coworkers. They face shared challenges, shared stresses, shared victories. They have extended, repeated, high proximity contact with people outside their relationships. And in the modern workplace, particularly in environments that value emotional intelligence and interpersonal effectiveness, the kind of genuine attentiveness and collaborative engagement that can feel emotionally significant is often more present at work than it is at home. The colleague who notices her idea and amplifies it in the meeting. The manager who checks in after a difficult week. The coworker who asks the question no one at home has thought to ask. These interactions are not inherently dangerous, but they become dangerous when the emotional environment at home is depleted enough that they begin to fill a vacuum. Emotional affairs are the category that most people underestimate, either because they haven't experienced one or because they have and found it easier not to categorize it clearly. An emotional affair is a relationship that has crossed the boundaries of normal friendship. In the depth of its emotional intimacy, in the exclusivity of the information shared, in the degree to which it meets needs that should be met in the primary relationship, without necessarily having a physical dimension. Emotional affairs can persist for months or years without physical contact, and they do as much or more damage to the primary relationship as physical affairs in most cases, because they represent a transfer of genuine emotional investment that is extremely difficult to recover. Opportunity plus dissatisfaction equals risk. That is the rule. Neither element alone is necessarily fatal to the relationship. A relationship with high dissatisfaction but zero opportunity is likely to persist, not happily, but persistently. A relationship with high opportunity but no dissatisfaction is unlikely to produce betrayal, because the person is not looking for what the opportunity offers. The dangerous condition is the combination. When the dissatisfaction has been building and the opportunity presents itself, the resistance that would otherwise be sufficient becomes insufficient. The conversation that would have been deflected gets continued. The message that would have been left unanswered gets a reply. The emotional affair that begins harmlessly and invisibly starts to fill the vacuum that the primary relationship has left. Now, to perhaps the most important section, the one that most people who haven't experienced this close-up don't fully understand. Cheating often begins with a conversation, with a vent, with the decision to tell someone else something that should have been said to the partner. This is where the emotional affair begins. Not with desire, not with intention, not with a decision to betray, with the simple act of turning towards someone else with something real. Venting to another man is the opening act of most emotional affairs that eventually become physical. It begins in a context that feels entirely innocent and entirely justified. She is frustrated about something, about work, about a conflict with the partner, about a feeling she has been unable to articulate or address within the relationship. And there is someone there, a friend, a colleague, an old acquaintance who is willing to listen, who asks follow-up questions, who seems genuinely interested in understanding what she is experiencing. And the conversation goes further than it would have a year ago because the hunger for that kind of genuine engagement has been building for months. Seeking advice is the next stage. Now the conversations have a structure. There is a recurring pattern of bringing real concerns, real dilemmas, real vulnerabilities to this outside person. And with each exchange, the intimacy deepens. Not necessarily in a physical way, but in the way that shared vulnerability always deepens intimacy. She knows things about him. He knows things about her. There is a quality of mutual understanding that has developed in these conversations that does not exist in the primary relationship. And that quality of understanding is genuinely valuable, genuinely felt, and now genuinely threatening to the relationship it is occurring outside of. Emotional intimacy shift is the point at which this process becomes functionally an affair, regardless of whether any physical contact has occurred. The emotional intimacy that should exist primarily within the relationship has shifted. There is now a level of depth, of openness, of genuine connection between her and someone else that exceeds what she experiences with her partner. She may still love her partner. She is not necessarily planning to leave, but the emotional center of gravity has moved. And once that center of gravity has moved, the physics of the situation have changed. Secrecy is the final element that transforms an emotionally intimate friendship into an emotional affair. The moment the conversations become something she would not tell her partner about, the moment she edits what she reports, the moment she closes the app when he walks in the room, the moment she tells herself that he just wouldn't understand, the relationship has crossed a line. The secrecy is not incidental. It is evidence that she herself recognizes that something is happening that falls outside the bounds of the primary relationship. And that recognition does not stop the process. It usually accelerates it. Once emotional exclusivity breaks, physical loyalty is fragile. The barrier between emotional and physical intimacy in this context is much lower than most people assume. Once a genuine, deep, emotionally intimate connection has developed with someone outside the relationship, once she feels more understood by this person than by her partner, once the conversations have reached a depth that creates genuine mutual attachment, the physical dimension is not a separate decision. It is the natural progression of an emotional closeness that has already crossed the most important boundary. Now, let's talk about the dynamics of power, because this is a dimension of infidelity that is rarely discussed directly but is consistently present. Cheating often follows a perceived shift in the power dynamic of the relationship, not power in a domineering sense, but the social and relational power that determines who feels more valued, more desired, more positioned in the relationship and in the external world. If she feels more dominant in the relationship, if she is the one who is more decisive, more directional, more responsible for the emotional and logistical management of the shared life, the dynamic that produces attraction is eroded. The woman who has been carrying the relationship, who has been making the decisions, who has been providing the direction and management that her partner has abdicated, that woman does not feel partnered with. She feels alone in a coupled arrangement. And the felt experience of being alone in a coupled arrangement is one of the most consistent precursors to seeking genuine connection elsewhere. If she feels less attracted, if the physical and psychological qualities that once made her partner compelling have degraded through neglect, through comfort, through the erosion of the discipline and presence that originally created the attraction, the biological engine of the relationship stalls. Attraction is not a feeling that can be sustained by decision alone. It requires inputs. The inputs are the things the partner does, embodies, and expresses that the biology responds to positively. When those inputs decline, the response declines with them. And the contrast with others who are newer, who have not had their edge smoothed by familiarity, who are still presenting the sharpened version of themselves rather than the comfortable version, becomes more acute. If she feels more independent, if her career has grown, her social network has expanded, her confidence has increased, her options have multiplied, while he has remained static, the equation of the relationship has changed. She is not the same person she was when they began, and he is. The growth differential creates a dynamic in which she is reassessing the relationship against a new internal standard, one that includes her expanded sense of what is possible and what she deserves. If she feels more desired elsewhere, if the validation, the attention, the expressed appreciation she is receiving outside the relationship consistently exceeds what she is receiving within it, The comparison problem becomes acute. She's getting more from the outside than from the inside. And the longer that pattern persists, the more the outside begins to feel like where her life actually is, and the inside begins to feel like an obligation. Perceived replaceability accelerates betrayal. When a man allows himself to become taken for granted, when he stops bringing the presence and the direction and the investment that make him feel irreplaceable to his partner, he has made a structural error. He has communicated through his behavior that his presence can be substituted, that the things he brings to the relationship could be sourced elsewhere without significant loss. This is not a message he intended to send, but it is the message his behavior broadcasts. And once a woman has begun to believe, consciously or not, that her partner could be replaced without catastrophic loss to her life, the psychological barrier to replacement begins to lower. Now, the philosophical layer, the one that makes the most sense of what we've been discussing. Love does not disappear overnight. This is one of the most disorienting truths about infidelity for the people who experience it, either as the unfaithful partner or as the betrayed one. The woman who cheats often still loves her partner. She is not acting from the absence of love. She is acting from the absence of felt investment, the active, behavioral, attentional expression of love that makes the love functional, present, and sufficient. Investment does not sustain itself. This is the crucial distinction. Love, in the abstract sense of attachment and care, can persist long after the active investment that expresses it has declined. People stay in relationships for years, past the point at which either partner is genuinely investing, because the love, the bond, the history, the attachment is still real, even if the investment is hollow. And in that hollowed out state, the relationship is technically intact, but functionally failing. It provides security without warmth, commitment without genuine presence, the label of partnership without the experience of it, commitment words versus emotional energy. That is the binary. The man who says all the right things, who expresses love verbally, who commits to the future in conversation, who uses the language of partnership, but who does not bring his emotional energy consistently and genuinely into the relationship, is creating a gap between word and experience. And it is the experience, not the words, that the woman is living inside. She hears the words, but she feels the absence. And over time, the absence becomes louder than the words. When emotional investment shifts, behavior follows. This is the final point in the psychological sequence. Once the emotional investment has migrated, once it is directed more consistently toward the outside relationship, the external validation source, the emotional affair, the behavior of the woman in the primary relationship begins to change in ways that are observable if you are paying attention. She is more distant, less engaged in the conversations that previously held her attention, more protective of her phone, her time, her interior life, less interested in physical intimacy, more easily irritated by small things, more likely to bring up old grievances that seemed resolved. These are not random behaviors. They are the behavioral expression of an internal reorientation that has already happened. Now the part that actually matters, because all of this is only useful if it can be applied. Prevention does not mean control. Trying to control a partner, to monitor her phone, to restrict her social life, to manage her external relationships from a place of insecurity, is not a prevention strategy. It is an acceleration strategy. It confirms the emotional suffocation that was already making the relationship difficult, and it destroys the trust and autonomy that a healthy relationship requires. What we are talking about is awareness, conscious, consistent maintenance of the things that actually sustain a relationship's emotional health and erotic vitality over time. Maintain emotional connection intentionally, not automatically, not by assumption, intentionally. This means scheduling the conversations that go beyond logistics. It means asking the questions that require real answers. Not how was your day, but what are you most excited about right now? And what's been weighing on you that you haven't said out loud? It means listening to the answers with genuine attention rather than processing them while thinking about something else. It means treating the emotional intimacy of the relationship as something that requires active maintenance, because it does. The relationship does not maintain its emotional depth automatically any more than a garden maintains itself. It requires ongoing tending. Keep polarity alive. This means maintaining the genuine masculine qualities, decisiveness, direction, groundedness, the willingness to lead and to hold a frame under pressure that created the attraction in the first place, not as a performance, as a genuine expression of who you are and the direction you are moving. The man who keeps growing, who is still building something, who has standards he maintains, who is still in some fundamental sense becoming, retains the quality of aliveness that sustains attraction. The man who stops growing, who settles into comfort, who flattens his masculine edge in the name of accommodation, that man is eroding the polarity that makes the relationship genuinely dynamic. Lad decisively, make choices, have opinions, initiate experiences, bring direction, not because your partner is incapable of leading, but because the willingness to take genuine initiative is an expression of investment and engagement. The man who defers everything is communicating, through every deferral, that he is not genuinely present in the construction of the shared life. He is along for the ride rather than at the wheel. And the woman who has been with a man who used to drive and now only rides feels the difference. Avoid complacency. Complacency is the relationship killer that presents itself as comfort. It is the state in which you have stopped investing in the relationship because it feels secure, and in which the security is slowly being eroded by the very lack of investment that your sense of security has enabled. The antidote to complacency is the ongoing decision to treat the relationship as something being built rather than something that is finished. To bring the same quality of intention and effort that you brought when the relationship was new. Not every day in exactly the same form, but as a consistent underlying orientation. Observe subtle withdrawal signs. The early signals of the emotional drift pattern we have been describing are detectable if you are present enough to notice them. She is less likely to share things spontaneously. The warmth of her physical contact has shifted subtly. She is more protective of her phone and her time. She seems to be finding her emotional sustenance primarily elsewhere. She has stopped raising certain topics, not because they are resolved, but because she has stopped expecting resolution. These signals are not proof of infidelity. They are evidence of emotional withdrawal, and the appropriate response to them is not accusation or interrogation. It is re-engagement. It is a genuine return of attention, presence, and investment to the relationship. Now the synthesis, the part where everything we have discussed comes together into a single clear picture. The number one reason is not lust. It is not physical desire, not the pursuit of novelty, not the simple presence of a more attractive alternative. Those elements may be present in the specific circumstances of specific cases, but they are never the cause. They are always downstream of the cause. The cause is perceived emotional and directional disconnection. The felt experience, accumulated over time of being emotionally unseen, emotionally unsupported, and relationally undirected. The experience of being with someone who has stopped investing genuinely, who is physically present but emotionally absent, who says the words but no longer brings the energy, who is comfortable but no longer compelling. This disconnection, when it persists, creates a vulnerability that was not there before. And vulnerability, when an opportunity appears, produces outcomes that devastate everyone involved. Cheating is usually a symptom, not the origin. This is the statement that changes how you should think about the entire subject. The affair is not the problem. The affair is the evidence of a problem that began much earlier and was much less visible. It is the end point of a process of disconnection, of validation deficit, of polarity erosion, of emotional investment migration that preceded it by months or years. The couple who focuses on the affair as the problem will never address the dynamics that produced it. The man who understands that the affair was a symptom will ask himself the harder question: what was the condition it was symptomatic of? And what would I have needed to do differently to change that condition? This is not blame shifting. The choice to cheat is always a choice. There are always alternatives to communicate, to leave, to address the problems directly rather than seeking their relief elsewhere. The choice to betray is a choice, regardless of the circumstances that made it easier. But choices are made in contexts, in the context of disconnection, of emotional absence, of a relationship that has gone stagnant while the needs it was supposed to meet go unmet. That context makes certain choices more likely than they would otherwise be. Understanding the context is not excusing the choice. It is understanding what produces the conditions in which the choice becomes more available. Here is the final point, the one that should change how you think about your relationship starting today. You have two options. You can assume that loyalty is automatic, that because the relationship is committed, because you have been together long enough to feel secure, because you have not done anything dramatically wrong, that the connection will sustain itself without ongoing investment. Many men operate on this assumption. It is the most expensive mistake in long-term relationships. Or you can actively maintain the connection and the attraction. You can treat the relationship as something that requires consistent, genuine, attentive investment. Not the investment of the early relationship, with its urgency and uncertainty and the energy of the new, but the deliberate investment of a man who understands that the things worth having require ongoing maintenance, who brings his emotional presence into the relationship consistently, who leads with genuine decisiveness, who notices his partner and says so, who builds the environment in which her need for validation, for genuine connection, for the sense of being with a man who is genuinely present, is met primarily within the relationship rather than anywhere else. Security without leadership decays. Connection without edge fades. These are not warnings about women. They are statements about the nature of intimate relationships and what they require to remain alive. Security is necessary, but security alone produces stagnation. The relationship needs direction, the sense that you are going somewhere together, that the man at its center is still moving and still bringing his partner into a future that is worth moving toward. Stay present, not just physically, emotionally, attentionally, deliberately present in the conversations that matter, in the moments when she's bringing something real to you, in the evenings that could easily be surrendered to parallel distraction. Your presence is the most powerful signal of investment available to you. Withdraw it, and the relationship hollows. Maintain it, and the relationship sustains. Stay decisive. Have direction. Make choices. Bring your genuine perspective and your genuine will to the construction of the shared life. The relationship does not need you to be perfect. It needs you to be present and engaged and moving forward. The passive man, the deferring man, the man who has stopped bringing his direction to the relationship, he has made himself optional in the dynamic that requires him to be essential. Stay emotionally aware, not just of your own emotional state, of hers, of the quality of the connection between you, of the subtle signals that tell you whether the relationship is alive and growing or whether it is beginning to drift. Pay attention, not from anxiety, from genuine investment in the person you have chosen and the life you are building together. Connection requires maintenance. It is not a state you arrive at and then inhabit passively. It is a practice, a daily practice of choosing to be genuinely present, genuinely engaged, and genuinely invested in the person across from you. That is the real answer. That is what actually makes a relationship secure. Not the ring, not the years, not the history. The daily decision to show up fully, to lead clearly, and to make the person you love feel like they are the most important presence in your life. Not because you said so once, but because your ongoing attention makes it undeniably true.